pleasure to introduce one of the greatest Chinese American veterans, Major General Bill Chen. He and his family, 3 generations of his family have served this country. And his father, Chen, actually was related to his activity during World War II, or somehow connected to what our previous speaker, General Bondo Chen, was doing. Because his father, Moon Chen, that time was a pilot in China, and later on his father becomes one of the Flying Tigers. And his brother, one brother served in U.S. Army infantry as a platoon leader. Another brother served in the Vietnam War, veteran. And his niece, one of his nieces, served in Afghanistan and the Iraqi War. So 3 generations, 5 persons have served this country. Let us give the General Chen and the Chen family a well-deserved round of applause. Major General Chen graduated from, actually I just learned when I drove him here, that he was born in Shanghai. When his father at that time was involved in the war against Japan in World War II. And Major General Chen graduated from the University of Michigan with a BS in engineering mathematics. So the genius was a genius. And then got a degree in aeronautics. He has served in U.S. Army for over 32 years and retired as a Major General. And as a Major General, he commanded the U.S. Army Missile Command during Operation Desert Shield. Now, let us welcome General Bill Chen to share his experience in the Army and U.S. Army forces. The title of is My View on Leadership. Thank you and welcome.
Okay, thank you for that very nice introduction. I'd like to make this very informal. So as I go along, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. Feel free to ask me any questions as I go along. My topic this morning is as shown on my views of leadership. And of course, the leadership journey that I went through. I'll also talk about some of the major challenges that I faced, the lessons learned, and then I'll end with some photos that might be of interest. Next chart. I'm fine. Okay, this is an outline of my presentation. I'm going to first start out by giving you my views on leadership, and then my leadership journey in order to accomplish some of the changes that I had to make myself. And related to that is the career development that goes along with my leadership journey. I'll talk about some vignettes, which are some individual incidences involving leadership. And then the major challenges that I faced. And then I'll summarize. Okay, these are some key points. You need to learn as you go along. Learn to be a leader. You need to take initiative, communicate effectively. You know, you'll have subordinates, but you need to develop those subordinates. And then each time you complete your mission, complete your task, you know, that gives you more confidence to go ahead as you progress. and use your intellect. Don't be reticent. You need to understand the value of interpersonal relationships. You know, it's not just the technical skills that you might have. It's not just your competence, but you really got to know how to get along with people, because basically, what is the definition of leadership? My definition of leadership is the art. Remember, I'm saying art, not science. The art of getting other people to get work done. And so you need to be able to have those relationships, because in time of need, to get something done, it depends upon people. And you need to get that support and respect from the people that you normally work for, because those are the ones that are going to help you in time of need. Okay, emulate good leadership. I'll talk about that some more. Manage expectations. You need to manage the expectations of the people that are working for you, as well as your bosses. Okay, now the leadership journey aligned with your career, of course, means as you progress, hopefully you're progressing in positions of increasing responsibility, but you need to continue to exercise leadership. Okay, here are the key points. Now, if you're currently in an organization, your bosses, by policy and practice, should be developing you for your leadership capabilities, developing the subordinates. But what I say is you yourself are your best leadership development as well as career management. You need to learn by observing, because when you observe other people, you can evaluate yourself, their effectiveness in the leadership issues that they face. And obviously emulate the leadership of those that you respect. You need to follow the career paths of your leaders. You know, one of the things I did, in those days, they didn't have Google, right? You can't just punch in and put in somebody's name, like the name of a general, and know what their career path is. So I would spend time in the library, in the military base libraries, just to look at, you know, the bios of general officers, what they did, what the career path they followed, to see if that's what I wanted to do. Okay, I say perform. Now, you can be the best performer in your organization, but you need to look not only at performance, but potential. For example, when I first came on active duty, and this was 1961, there were company commanders that were very senior in age, but they were company commanders, a lot of them from the Korean War. So what did they do? They really were very effective company commanders at the grade of captain. But what was their potential? You know, not very much beyond colonel, captain, or major. And so, you know, in your capacity as you're progressing, not only do you need to concentrate on your performance for the mission at hand, but also demonstrate that you have the potential to go beyond that level and achieve higher levels of responsibility. Okay, you need to know and understand the culture of your organization, you know, whether it's business or in the military. Understand the customs, the traditions, the culture of that organization. Centralized versus decentralized control. I think everybody knows the difference. But what you should do is to evaluate the situation at hand to determine which style of control you should exercise. Should it be very centralized or decentralized? Okay, I see a major here from the Corps of Engineers. Have you been a company commander?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you had a battalion commander, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I was a battalion commander, and we had, for example, 3 line companies. Company A, Company B, and Company C. So the companies were commanded by captains. And I can tell you that how I worked with each company commander to get them to excel different. You know, the B company commander, you could give a mission order to say, we need to accomplish such and such, and I could leave him alone, and he would get the job done superbly. On the other hand, you could have other company commanders, this applies in civilian life as well, other subordinates that you have, but you might have to give them very detailed instruction at the very beginning. You need to follow up to see what they're doing, and then check on it. Now that may not be the right way, or they may not be what you really ought to do, because you really ought to give them those mission type orders, but to get the job done from a higher level, it may be that you have to exercise a lot of centralized control or decentralized control. Okay, be fortunate, of course, work for the good bosses. You may not have control of that, but that's all part of life, you know. Nobody can really dictate what they really want. You are put into a situation, you might have a good boss, you may not have a good boss. And of course, the good bosses can help you a lot more. Okay, I want to concentrate on that last bullet there, stand out while blending in. Now, the first obvious thing you might say is, hey, those two things are contradictory, you know? Well, how can you stand out and how can you blend in? Okay, I'm of Chinese origin. I already stand out. I can't do anything about it. But one of the important things is, especially in the military, you have to blend in. You have to blend in with the customs, the traditions, the culture of that organization. Then they can identify, hey, he's one of us. I'll follow you. Or if you don't,
That's Richard just walking. Richard just walking.
I would say that by being of Chinese origin, I stood out, and that was an advantage. You know, every assignment I had, from second lieutenant on up to major general, in my time, there were no contemporaries, no peers that were Chinese Americans. There were no subordinates, and there were no bosses. So, what can you do to stand out? Well, if you're in a crowd, an example might be somebody's giving a briefing and it's time for question and answers. You can ask a good penetrating question. And people will look around and say, oh, it's this guy, Chen, that asked that. And if it's a good question and right to the point, you know, they'll recognize that and they'll remember that. Hey, that guy's pretty smart. Or, you know, that was exactly what I wanted myself to say, but I didn't have the courage to bring it out. So you have to take advantage of the opportunity. If, for example, you're a Chinese American, you already stand out, but you can stand out more by performance, by speaking out, and being recognized. Okay, so what was my career development? Okay, I started college in 1956 and I graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1960. I stayed on for another year to get a master's degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering. But what happened in 1957? 1957 was Sputnik 1, the shot across the bow to everybody here in the United States, because it was a Soviet satellite, the first satellite of the world. Okay, the U.S. response to that was in January of 1958, the Explorer 1 satellite. That was headed up by Dr. Werner Braun, who was in the Army Missile Command at that time, an agency called the Advanced Ballistic Missile Agency at Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama. But what propelled that satellite was the Jupiter C intermediate range ballistic missile, an Army missile. Of course, I was 18 years old at that time, a sophomore in ROTC. Anybody here in ROTC? An ROTC graduate? Okay, great. Well, actually it had great meaning to me to be in ROTC. Even though I was in engineering, I almost majored. You could say I majored in ROTC, but I was 18 years old, a sophomore at that time, and I said, when I come on active duty, I want to work on Army missiles and rockets. And that's what I did. I'll give you an example. That was 1958 when I was a sophomore. Who would have believed that 31 years later, in 1989, I became a brigadier, a major general, and I commanded that organization with Dr. Werner von Braun. Okay, so you have to have a passion to do something and then apply to it. Now, one of my first assignments in 1963 was to the U.S. Army Missile Command, and I was assigned to a project that did R&D testing to shoot other Army missiles down. And that was the beginning of my recurring assignments dealing with air defense and missile defense. Okay, so another part of my career development was I sought assignments in weapons systems development. So I worked on weapons systems development from an operational side, a user side, as well as engineering development projects, and also project management. Okay, but meanwhile, I'm in the Army. In the Army, the basic element of that is when there's a war, you have to have combat experience, you have to go to the war zone. And so I volunteered for Vietnam. And even after that, I was there in 1966 to 1967. Unfortunately, the war kept on going. And in 1973, I volunteered for the Vietnam War again and went to Laos. Okay, most everybody here is from Southern California, right? Everybody, Southern California. Do you know the Hmong population, right? A lot of Hmong. And what happened, of course, in Laos was the Hmong under General Vang Pao, Major General Vang Pao, led, he was in the Royal Lao Army, but they fought against the North Vietnamese attacks coming down into Laos. Now, some of you may know this, but the reason the United States had accepted all the Hmong, or a lot of the Hmong, to come here is because of General Vang Pao and the fighting that they did against the North Vietnamese. Because by doing that, it reduced the number of U.S. troops then that would have been in Laos. And so I happened to be there before the protocols for the ceasefires, and one of my special assignments was I was the last military officer in Long Chen, Laos, with General Vang Pao. Okay, now, in the military service, we have promotion boards for promotion. We have terminology for regular promotions, fast promotions, etc. And I was lucky to get a promotion to lieutenant colonel 2 years, what they call 2 years below the zone. In other words, 2 years prior to your normal year group. Okay, one of the other things I wanted was a high-level staff assignment, meaning at the Department of Army level in the Marine Marine Corps, it would be with the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Air Staff. Now, a lot of people don't want that because it's in the Pentagon, it's long hours, Washington, D.C. is an expensive area, and so, but I volunteered and said that I wanted a high-level staff assignment, and it was an opportunity to learn how the Army operates. And I was lucky enough to command a battalion, and with that successful battalion command, you can be selected for what's called the War College or Senior Service College. That happened to me. Early on, I wanted to be a project manager for a major weapon systems, like a missile system or an air defense system, and I got that. And that's when I began to think as a colonel, hey, maybe I have a chance to be a brigadier general. So, in my career, I focused on weapon systems development, but not as a warrior, not as a warfighter. I became the commanding general of the U.S. Army Missile Command, and also my last assignment as a program executive officer for missile defense. I headed up all the missile defense systems of the Army. Okay, what I have here is some vignettes of each grade. However, if I talked about each of these, and I even spent 5 minutes on each of these, we'd be here till 6 o'clock. So I won't do that. I'm going to only pick upon the time when I was a battalion commander. Now, in the question and answer period, if you want me to come back to this and say, tell me about such and such, I can do that. Okay, so I was a battalion commander, and there was this one time when I had been in command for 1 year. Okay, now what happens after commanding for 1 year compared to the year before? Well, you get to be more confident, right? You think you can do anything. All right, so it happened to be that after 1 year as a battalion commander, we had a new brigade commander come in. So I thought I was smart, okay, and I analyzed all the disciplinary actions in the battalion. And the indicators for discipline are things like Article 15, which is, non-judicial punishment, something less than a court-martial. Another is the number of AWOLs, absent without leave. And another is what we call a blotter entry. A blotter entry is something, soldiers get into a fight in the barracks, and then the MPs come, so they get written up. So all these blotter entries look bad, right, for the battalion commander. Okay, so I did an analysis, and I gave a report to the new brigade commander. Now, the timing, of course, during that time period it was before the all-volunteer Army. So we had a lot of draftees. But I did this analysis, and I briefed the battalion commander, and what I said is, I did an analysis of all the discipline indicators, and my conclusion is there was a good correlation, in fact, 100% correlation between these disciplinary problems and high school graduates. And therefore, what the Army should do for the all-volunteer Army was to only have high school graduates. Okay. But you know what the brigade commander told me? He pointed the finger at me and said, that's a leadership problem, You take what you get in the way of manpower, resources, whatever their skills and capabilities are. That's a leadership problem. Okay, so, I was a little dejected, and that probably was a mistake on my part to do all this analysis. But that's what I did. Now, what happened 6 months later? First, I was no longer the commander, but in 6 months later, I read a report by the Department of Army that said, for the all-volunteer force, we want to have, and we must have, only high school graduates. Now, later on, I met that same brigade commander, and guess what? The brigade commander didn't get promoted to brigadier general, but I Okay, but I won't talk about any more of these. Each one of these is a little more, is interesting, but we don't have time for that. We can come back to it. Let me tell you about the major leadership problems that I faced. Now, the first one was when I was a colonel. The second one when I was a major general. And I assume that a number of you are in business or work for private industry, so this is something after I retired and I was working for a defense company. Okay, but for each challenge, I'll talk about the facts associated with that. I'll talk about the actions that I took, and then the leadership lessons learned. Okay, the first one when I was a colonel, and there was a program that was in trouble. A weapon systems development program that was in trouble. It had hardware and software problems. The system wasn't meeting the threat. So this was a gun air defense system, and so all of you know, you shoot a gun and it just follows a ballistic path unless you have correctable ammunition. And so against a maneuvering aircraft and against jamming, basically beyond a certain range just doesn't work. Okay, but the program was in trouble at the same time. There were 263 units already in production. Congress was very concerned. They issued language, congressional language, that said that there shall be a force-on-force evaluation and the procurement funds are withheld pending the conduct of the force-on-force evaluation. Meanwhile, I was the new program manager. So I was faced with complying with that congressional language, and also I had a weak project management staff. So the challenge becomes how to take charge of that program. Okay, meanwhile, the national press, Washington Post, New York Times, all had bad articles about the program. The Army fired the Brigadier General. There were briefings required by the Secretary of Defense, and I was the project manager. Normally, the project manager doesn't ever see the Secretary of Defense, but I had to brief the Secretary of Defense twice. And the Army had no funding for this special test. So, fortunately, I got handpicked by the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. And of course, the Vice Chief of Staff has 4 stars, but fortunately, I had worked for him when he was a 2-star general, and I was a lieutenant colonel, so he knew me. And I got handpicked for this Brigadier General's position without being a Brigadier General. Now, friends of mine would then say that, hey, do I congratulate you or do I give you condolence? Okay, so what did I do? I energized responsible agencies for the test because nobody had done the planning, nobody had gotten the funding on this follow-on evaluation test. And I took a blank sheet paper approach. What that meant was, okay, if nobody did anything, I started with a blank page and I told my staff, put down what people have done because that'll tell you what everything is that needs to be done. I raised the issue of no funding to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Anybody here know what an elevator speech is? What's an elevator speech? Right. It's like you're going up an elevator, you have an opportunity to talk to the CEO of a company, so what do you say in order to get something out of it? So here I was, I was in a conference room, and actually I talked to my boss to say, hey, I want to talk to the Vice Chief of Staff privately. But that never occurred. I was sitting in the back of the room, and the Vice Chief of Staff was ready to go, full lineup of generals, and then he turned around and called me by, he used to call me Billy. He says, Billy, what do you have? So what I initially intended as a very private meeting turned out to be in front of this big audience with these bunch of generals up front. And so I gave my elevator speech that was very short. And so I said, sir, I need your help. We don't have any funding for this follow-on evaluation test. We don't have a test range that's been designated, and we don't have the test unit. And that's all I said, because they had other generals in the room. He turned around then to a 3-star who happened to be on the Army staff, and his name was Lou, first name Lou. He says, Lou, what are you doing about this? I didn't have to say anything else, because he immediately started to say some words about how difficult it is to get funding and all that, but he got the funding later on. So, you know, that's an example of taking advantage of an opportunity to get to a senior level, to get something done. Okay, so we conducted the follow-on evaluation. We briefed the Secretary of Defense. We actually briefed that we terminate the program, keep the units that we already produced, but the SecDef decided to terminate the whole program. But fortunately for me, the fact that a program is terminated didn't terminate my career. So that was okay. So what are the lessons learned? You got to take ownership. You got to get out there. You lead by example and mutual respect, because I was only a colonel. They had other generals that were responsible for other stuff. And so I was very careful in my dealings, and hopefully I gained their respect. And used a disciplined approach. I had internal project office difficulties. Of course, I fired the deputy project manager and went from there. You have to be willing to take risks, meaning your individual career risk as well as program risk. And you need to capitalize. There was a lot of notoriety on this program, you know, all the bad press and all that. But I took it on, and of course, I did my best to perform what was required from the congressional life. Okay, this was when I was a 2-star general, and I headed up all the Army's missile programs. There happened to be 2 programs that were funded at one time for engineering development, but then the funding was lost, and we could only take one of those programs into engineering development. Meanwhile, you can see who the contractors are. Representing the big state of Massachusetts, Senator Kennedy, Texas, Charlie Wilson. Anybody hear of Charlie Wilson? There was a movie made of that. Okay, so he represented Loral, later acquired by Lockheed Martin. So now that the funding was cut, what was my challenge? I could only have funding for one contractor in engineering development. So at the time, neither of the technologies were proven. I mentioned to you the high stakes associated with the value. There was a large dollar value of the contract, and then the states that were represented. The chairman of the board of one of the companies would visit the Secretary of the Army, and of course I get a phone call from the Secretary of the Army saying, can't you make a decision earlier? And I had to say no. In fact, he called me twice. I had to say no twice because there was the integrity of the process and the program, and we need to finish the evaluation. So one of the key things was fair and open competition. And so what I personally did was each of the companies had a vice president. And so I personally called and talked to the vice president involved to explain the process and the evaluation criteria, which is number 1, missile firing test, number 2, engineering data, and number 3, hardware in the loop simulation, because we could never get enough money to fire the number of missiles. We had to use hardware in the loop simulation. And I established the process for doing that. And I almost did this all by myself because I had the experience in developing the selection process. We had an RFP issued, but what was important was I established a missile selection board made up of the Army's experts. Then on top of that, an advisory board, and the advisory board represented various organizations that have a stake in this. The user community, developer community, the higher level operations research analysis, etc. And so each of the contractors understood the process, and I resisted a decision until we had all the data from the evaluation. Now, one of the technologies was hit to kill, which means like a bullet hitting a bullet, the other a blast fragmentation or fusing approach where you get to a certain distance, detonate a warhead, and then try and get the reentry vehicle. Okay, so what were the leadership lessons learned? You need to use the wisdom of your experience, develop that vision and sense of direction that needs to take place, ensure a transparent and fair process, and establish and empower the team to get the job done. So you have to satisfy the stakeholders, maintain the integrity of the process. Okay, the third challenge was after I retired, I worked for a defense company. Now the defense company had a joint venture in Turkey with a Turkish company, and we produced combat vehicles. So I was assigned to that joint venture. But in the 2005 time frame, business level was down. So anybody know what contract backlog means? Okay, contract backlog is the dollar value of the contracts that you're executing. And if you don't have a contract backlog of much bigger than that, what happens at the end of the contract? Nothing, because you're out of business. Okay, so at that time, the backlog was only $37 million. That's like less than a year's worth of work. So I was the U.S. general manager that was assigned. They told me ahead of time that instead of a regular 3-year tour, that tour might be cut down to a year or so, because the JV might be terminated. And of course, this is a new cultural environment, working in Turkey, different kind of attitude and work ethic, etc. Okay, meanwhile, there was a quality management evaluation done, and Lloyd's of London was the company that did that. And one of their audits said that we need to have a strategic plan. But when I got there, nothing had been done. So the challenge is, what are you going to do? What is the future course of the company? And how do you build the business case? Okay, meanwhile, the joint venture was really only a licensed production of a product. So it was a single product, a combat vehicle, under license, export license. And when you have a manufacturing operation of a single product and it's only production, what kind of engineers do they have? So either manufacturing engineers or support of production engineers, not R&D engineers, not development engineers, etc. Okay, so what needed to happen? We need to kind of build up the R&D development capability. We need to develop new products, new customers, and establish a new business process for the company. So coming into that company, I had already retired from the Army. I had about 10 plus years of experience in a U.S. company in engineering development and production, and I had previous system development experience. Okay, so we needed a strategic plan. I was the general manager, and so I led the development of the strategic plan. Okay, I mentioned to you culture before, like, okay, what was the Turkish culture? Okay, here in the U.S., if you wanted to do a project, you know, you could send out a bunch of emails or send out a bunch of directives saying, I'd like to get your inputs, and then you sort through the inputs and build up a plan. Well, what was the culture in Turkey? They didn't like to respond to stuff in writing, okay? Because, why? Maybe they didn't want to commit themselves in writing. However, if you got them in a group, they would talk, and they would actually have good contributions. So I learned that after the first kind of message that went out asking for inputs. And so I would have these regular meetings and draw out and get ideas. And so we developed a strategic plan that had a vision, mission, strategic objectives, strategies, and objectives. Now, has anybody here done a strategic plan before? Okay, sometimes there's a tendency to build up the volume of a strategic, nothing but big notebooks that then you put on a shelf. So purposely, what I wanted was a concise, in fact, you put it on one page with all those elements, starting with the mission down to objectives. And what I did with the objectives, I keyed that to the annual performance bonuses. So that with those objectives, sure, you achieve them and you get a better bonus. Okay, so we entered new markets, new products. We became a multi-product company, and I was there for 6 years. Now, I was in the Army for 32 years, and what is the average length of time in an assignment? 2 years, maybe 3 years at the most. In some cases, you go on a short tour, and it's 12 months. So you could make decisions and not have to abide by them or live with the consequences. But if you're there for 6 years, you have to make sure that you've made the right decisions, because you're going to be accountable when you're still around. So what happened after 6 years? We captured new product contracts. The backlog grew to $1.2 billion. Now, the other lesson is, if you have to eventually, in this case from Turkey, come back home, right? You should leave on a high, right? While the backlog is there, it's time to go. That's what I did. The number of employees grew to 570. So, meanwhile, you're governed by a board of directors. What does the board of directors want? Right? They want dividends, because the dividends from the company then get split among the joint venture partners. And now the other bad thing about it, though, is sometimes they want the dividends so much, they don't give you back some of those retained earnings so that you can, invest in the joint venture. Okay, so again, you have to lead up front, you have to motivate, and when you talk about a strategic plan, make it a viable strategic plan and not something that is put on a shelf. So you got to set up the processes, and one of the things we did on a budgetary basis, each year we have to do an annual budget. And of course, each year we have a spending plan that we want. But the other thing we did was we keyed the go-ahead of the spending for the year based upon accomplishments. And then, so if you didn't perform on such and such a contract, then, you know, you can't continue an investment for the future. And again, I mentioned manage expectations, and that's what we did. Okay, I don't want to spend much time on this because you've heard it all before. All right, so here are some charts. Living the dream. Now, another title for this chart could be The Spirit of World War II. Okay, because here I was, maybe 4 years old, 5 years old. My mother was the one who dressed me in this uniform. And so, you know, that was the spirit in those days, maybe not necessarily today. So, who would have believed that could happen? Okay, the picture on the left, I was in Vietnam 1966 to 1967. I was an advisor to the Vietnamese Army. Now today, what do we hear today about Afghanistan? A lot of the American military are there as advisors. But what was the situation in Vietnam in that time frame of 1966? The tendency was you could be an advisor, but you're not as good as somebody in the U.S. force structure. And so, you know, people would say, why do I want to be an advisor? Now, in my case, I was an advisor, and later on when I went to Thailand, I was an advisor to the Royal Thai Army. When I was in Laos, I was also an advisor to the Royal Army. So somehow I was able to be an advisor and still get advanced. On the right-hand side, you'll see me. When I was in Laos, I was wearing civilian clothes every day. And this was with Major General Bang Pao. Okay, here's a picture of me, newly promoted as a Major General, and this was the day of my assumption of command of the U.S. Army Missile Command, Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. And my lovely bride is in the back here. Yeah, Chief of Staff. Oh, all right. So one of the things that occurred was our president came for a visit. So I managed to get I actually have an autograph picture of this. And of course, my last assignment, Program Executive Officer for Missile Defense, heading up all the theater and missile defense programs in the Army. Now, my grandfather on my father's side was a Chinese railroad worker with the Southern Pacific Railroad. And so my father, shown on the upper part, was a pilot in World War II in the Army Air Corps. Before that, he was a pilot for CNAC, China National Aviation Corporation. He was also an employee of a company called CAMCO, Central Aircraft Manufacturing Corporation. Has anybody heard of CAMCO before?
Yes.
Tell us what CAMCO is.
Campbell was the first in the United States supplied to China of a P-40 or biplane assembly in Yunnan.
Okay, CAMCO stood for Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. It was headed up, the president was William Pauley, who was the representative in China for Curtiss-Wright Corporation. Now, all of you have probably heard of the American Volunteer Group and the Flying Tigers, General Chenault and the American Volunteer Group. Now, when they went to China in 1941, they went as civilians. They were employees of CAMCO. And so CAMCO supported the American Volunteer Group. All right, so I have a couple of brothers that were all in the Army. I also have a daughter that's currently a major helicopter pilot. So what am I doing now? Enjoying retirement. So my two sons shown on the bottom right. Son Stephen is sitting in the back. Okay, so this concludes my presentation, and I would be glad to answer any questions. Yes.
General Chen, thank you very much for your very informative and interesting presentation. My name is Becky Lei. I'm a motivational speaker. So leadership is among the topics I talk about all the time. So I really understand and appreciate what you were saying about understand the culture of the company and also stand out but blending in. And I wonder, my question is, if the culture of the company is against your own personal value, such as dishonesty and corruption, and in your pursuing of the ladder, the excellence of leadership, have you encountered such a situation? And how did you handle it with dignity and courage?
Okay, well, I can tell you that I was very fortunate. You know, how do we survive these days? We're fortunate, as I mentioned, we work hard and we work for good bosses. And so I can say that I've never been faced with that situation in a company that has a culture that, you know, I did not subscribe to. So from that standpoint, that's an easy answer. But I can understand, and I would say that if faced with that situation, you know, that individual needs to make a hard decision. You know, it's time to terminate that relationship. That's what I would say. Yes.
Hi, I'm Stephen Chen. I come from mainland China 30 years ago. My question to you is that since you hold such a top secret positions, your background, the Chinese background, have a security clearance issues and security clearance.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood the question. I think that you were talking about working in the classified area. Did that have any effect or whatnot? Is that your question?